And I want to talk to you about something that they write in the very end of their deviancy chapter. They talk about the idea of race. And they say that the modern concepts of race did not exist until the very end of the colonial period. And they're trying to make a point, which is true, that during this time, we talked about this a little bit when we talked about the Atlantic Africa chapter. There wasn't a concept, a unitary concept, that all the people on the continent of Africa would be grouped into a race, or that all the people in Native America would be grouped into a race, or that we'd have these blocks of people who consider themselves to be a race. And even toward the end of the colonial period, we still see this concept emerging. So it's a fairly recent idea. But I guess what I want to say is, then it had to be developing. If they're saying the modern concepts of race did not exist until the very end of the colonial period, then it had to mean it had to be developing in the colonial period. And so they're kind of dodging the issue with, how did we get this concept? Where did it come from? And I am going to tell you that in fact it is in the colonial Americas where this got invented, the idea that people come in these blocks of types or physical types. This is where it started to happen, and I think we need to talk about, things are for various reasons very fluid in Latin America, but nevertheless we see these ideas emerge. So, to get a little anthropological on you, in the world around 1492, if we looked across the continents, what we have is what the biologists call a clinal distribution of skin color, or a gradual distribution. That is to say, people moved around, they still moved around, obviously, but if you took a walk from Northern Europe down into Africa, it was a gradual change. There wouldn't be a place where you crossed a river and you're like, aha, on one side are the white people and on the other side are the black people. It was a gradual change all the way down, and the same went with going from east to west and north to south. There were gradual skin color changes. And human skin color is perfectly clinal, in the sense that if we lined up people from darkest to lightest, there's no dividing line. There's no place that, you can draw lines, but there's all the pigments exist. Now, what colonialism did is, once you start moving people across the ocean, is to take some of those clinal variations and turn them into this idea of race. Now, this took time, and it was accomplished differently, or it got done differently in different areas, but it was, in fact, a product of people moving transoceanically and meeting people that weren't necessarily their geographical neighbors, but would have been raised in circumstances and in climates and geographies that were probably much different, and then being put together on the same plantations or in the same area, and some people being put into various laboring situations. Now, like I said, there were various ideas about race that were developing during this period, and one of the big contrasts that has been made and has been used by anthropologists to underscore why we believe race is not existent out there in nature to be classified, but is something we do socially and then put onto people, are the differences between how race is done in the United States and how it is looked at in many parts of Latin America. So, for example, if we look at one of the most amazing people to walk the earth, Halle Berry, who won the Oscar for Best Actress in a Leading Role in 2002, what was important about this moment? Why was this celebrated? We can be a different race than our own biological mom or dad. We can be assigned to a different race. And so we believe that it's melanin or skin color, but we don't really look, well, anybody who has a little bit of melanin, we assign to a different race, but we don't really investigate in the ways that, say, Brazilians look at skin color and decide based on skin color. We just have these rules for how we do it, and it has to do with these ideas of what we're going to call hypodescent. So let me just get into what our rules are for how we classify people and why that's different. So in the US, we usually make a fairly rigid distinction, and our major dividing line in this society has been between white and black. And part of that has to do with the fact that, as you saw from the global map, there were certain people who were brought to the Americas, and there are other people who were simply not part of as much of the colonial experience. In the United States, most of the time, if there's a mixture, we follow what the anthropologists call rules of hypodescent, that whatever you're going to be assigned the lower social category. So what happens to someone like Halle Berry is, although her mother is white, her father is black, and so she is simply assigned to be black. And so if you are the product of a white and black union, in general, you're assigned to be black. Or if you were the product of a white and indigenous union, you would be assigned to be indigenous. And in its most extreme form, this was done in various laws in the United States. So in some states, it'd be like, well, if you're a quarter, or if you're an eighth, or if you're a 16th. But I think this was in Louisiana, it was called the one drop rule. If you have any African ancestry, then you're going to be assigned as African. And it was, like I said, enforced by a number of laws about where you could live, laws about where you could go to school, laws about who you could marry. Now, in Latin America, people in general have said or feel that ideas about race are more negotiable, that they're more up for debate, that people tend to change. Is one of the points they make at the end of this chapter, is that people would kind of argue about their where they should be in society. There is also the presence of multiple categories. So as opposed to the idea that people only come in 2 or 3 or 4, there might be different kinds of categories. And when people mix together, you might also go up the ladder. You might hyperdescend so that you would be assigned, you would be able to climb up rather than being lowered. Now, they did try, as you see in these chapters, there were numerous attempts to legislate people of different ancestry. But in practice in Latin America, this didn't work very well. I mean, again, like in the United States, there were often laws about who could be in a city after sundown, for example. But there was just a lot of, as we'll discuss, there's a lot of stuff going on. So in general, the United States has been portrayed as a pretty rigid society when it comes to race and having this white-black distinction, whereas Latin America and the Caribbean have been described as being more fluid. Now, I want to talk about this fluidity in a few different ways. This is something they mention in the book are these casta paintings. And these were kind of these elaborations in which people would describe various mixes and then assign a category to them. So if you mix together, if an and you had like, 16 different blocks on here. So if you mix together an Indian and a Spaniard, then that would be a mestizo or a mix. Whereas if you mix together and someone from Africa, a black and a Spaniard, then that would be a mulatto, and that would be your category. You wouldn't be assigned to another category, you'd just be kind of a mix. Or if you were mixed Indian black, this term got used as zombo, which is probably perhaps simply a derogatory term. But now they say that sometimes people look at these casta paintings and interpret them in a modern sense, and we shouldn't, that these aren't exactly racial categories. And they are correct, but you can see that people are beginning to speculate about these things. These are more like ideal types, and they do open the opportunity for assigning people into these categories, but there's a lot of them, or they're potentially intermediate. The other factor is, as I said, there's possible hyperdescent. So if you have someone who is Spanish having a child with an Indian person, then that would be a mestiza. If then that person who is a mestiza gets together with another Spaniard, then you'd move up to a castiza. And then if the castiza and the Spanish get together, then you could become like full Spanish again. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but the idea was you could improve your social standing over generations. So unlike the idea that often would hold in Americas, where over 3 generations you would just remain, even if you were at that point, only had a quarter African ancestry, you'd still be classified as Black. In many Latin American societies, you move up the rank. Now, as I mentioned, in Brazil, they actually do look at your skin color and examine your skin color and then have different words for what race you'd be. And, in some parts of Brazil, people say that they either get lighter or darker over a lifetime. And some people say that, during the summer months when they're working outside, they become a different race than during the winter months. So it really is, people talking about skin color. And the other thing that is sort of negotiable there is there's a very famous Brazilian phrase, which is that money whitens, that the higher up the social ladder you go, regardless of your phenotypical skin color, then you get to be more white, like Pele. Anybody know who Pele is anymore? Noah? Yeah, I mean, Lionel Messi is now competing for the greatest of all time, but there will never be another Pele. Pele was once described as like God would play soccer if he devoted full time to it. So, one of the most famous Brazilian soccer players, obviously very phenotypically dark-skinned. But one of my friends was an anthropologist in Brazil and asked somebody, well, what race is Pele? And they said, well, Pele's white. He's like, what? It's like money whitens, because he'd risen to the top of Brazilian society. And so he'd be considered differently. Now, why do we have this difference of the rigidity and fluidity, different constructions of race going on? Part of it is probably simply demographic. As we have seen in the Anglo colonies of the United States, the number of imported Africans was less. It's a lot different to have over 4 million people imported into Brazil versus 500,000 in the United States or in various Caribbean countries. Also, the indigenous populations were greater in the Aztec area, in the Maya area, in the Inca area. There were huge, huge numbers of indigenous populations which kept going. Whereas in the United States, there were some there were some large concentrations, but in general, the numbers were smaller of both indigenous and Black populations. There also is something of a cultural difference here. The English legal code, and this applies even to places like Jamaica, was in general pretty strict and enforced, versus the codes of Spain and France tended to be, maybe in part because they had already been living together longer, you might say, they tended to be a little more, a little less restrictive. Not that they were better, but they had different ideas. In Saint-Domingue, the French colony, which would later become Haiti, they had a whole number of regulations for the people they called the gens de couleur, the people of color. And one of the interesting things about Saint-Domingue, the French colony, is that if a white planter had offspring with an enslaved woman, those offspring were legally freed. And they became free people of color. Now, this would not apply in the United States, obviously. And it didn't apply in places like Jamaica either, which were under the English laws. But in this French code, those children had to be freed. And as I mentioned, before the Haitian Revolution, it is speculated that as much as 25% of the plantations and perhaps 25% of the enslaved people were owned by these free people of color who'd become prosperous, or some of them had become prosperous in this colony. Now, this is a very different idea than would prevail in the United States, or what the United States was emerging. And in fact, of course, famously, Thomas Jefferson had a number of children with with Sally Hemings.
His sister, technically, or not sister, his wife's sister.
His wife's sister by his, yeah, because
Enslaved.
she was enslaved.
She was her half slave.
But it's a half sister because of his father-in-law,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, which is super weird. And those kids were enslaved. Now they did, some of them became free, but they weren't automatically free, right? Whereas in the French colonies, they would have been. I've been thinking about this because, we're told the story of Jefferson and how he, some people are like, did he agonize about this? But I don't know if anybody, Jefferson was a famous Francophile, right? He knew about France, and he must have known about this, right? He must have known about the French code. I don't know if anybody's ever done anything. I have to look into this. Might be onto something anyway. There's also obviously a gendered aspect to this. We've talked about this, that sort of in the Anglo world, you had more families coming over, whereas in the Spain, Portugal, France colonies, it would, from the time of the conquistadors, it would be people coming over to make their fortune or to try to run the plantations. And then, although again, this happened a lot in the United States too, but these unions might happen more frequently or be more a part of that society. One of the other ideas that is something that emerges through this system is the idea of what people today call colorism. Now, many of us have talked about racism. It's a very common word, but the idea of colorism is something that perhaps comes up more frequently in the Latin American context. And it has to do with the time of these colonies, and they mention this as that, variations or gradations of skin color were examined and, and together with social class become this important marker. And during this period, some of the harshest laws and regulations were reserved for the descendants of Africans. And it leaves us with a world which is racist, yes, but it is also very structured along the lines of being particularly racist against forms of blackness and those kinds of ideas of of physical features. The thing about colorism is it's a preference for light skin tones and for the features of whiteness. This also occurs, it's not just something, it occurs within Latin America. So there'd be this idea that you want to have those features that are associated with wealth and whiteness. And it even happens within Black communities. And so it's something that now a lot of white people like me don't know that we might be subconsciously also participating in colorism. If you look at many of the people that are, that are said to be the first African American or the first Black person to do something, white Americans tend to have a preference for those who are more on the lighter skin tone of things. And they've even done psychological studies where they'll say, they give people two pictures and they'll say these two people have committed a crime, the same crime. How much should they be sentenced? And people will give harsher sentences to those who seem to have darker skin or darker skin tones. Barack Obama, our first Black president, is also on the lighter side of things. Or Kamala Harris, our first African American vice president. We say that she is African American or Black because of her, I guess mostly because of her Jamaican father, who, as you can see, is probably here on the lighter side of what people would have been in Jamaica. And probably gets a decent amount of melanin from her mother, who is South Asian Indian, of course. And so, this is something that structures, although we don't always notice it, our own society, both within Latino and African American communities and within how whiteness occurs in our own society and across the world. There's actually, even in many countries, there's a huge market for various skin whitening techniques and stuff to do with your skin and hair to make it seem lighter. So this has become a pretty huge issue around the world, but it really comes to us from the colonial experience in Latin America. Again, it's constructed in different ways in Latin America. And that's one of the reasons why anthropologists say race is a social construction, in that it's not given, it emerges at a particular historical moment, but it does have these huge effects on people's lives.